If you watched Game of Thrones but didn't read the books, you would have missed out on many interesting minor characters. One of these minor characters is a man named Nimble Dick Crabbe. Nimble Dick was briefly the traveling companion and guide for Brienne as she wandered through the Riverlands trying to find Sansa Stark. This was just after Joffrey's wedding when he was killed and everyone was blaming Sansa and Tyrion, and Sansa had just mysteriously disappeared with Dantos Hollard. Which, if you don't remember, Dantos was that guy who, on Joffrey's name day celebration, he showed up drunk, and so as punishment, Joffrey was going to kill him, and Sansa convinced him not to, and so Joffrey decided instead to just make Dantos his fool. Dantos was also the man who gave Sansa the hairnet that she wore into the wedding, which contained a little piece of poison that Olenna removed and placed in Joffrey's cup. So that's how Dantos ended up involved in this little murder scheme and disappearing with Sansa Stark. He was working for Littlefinger and was quickly killed by Littlefinger to keep his mouth shut after the job was done. But nobody besides the people involved actually knew about this, so when Brienne was looking for Sansa after she went missing, she assumed that Sansa was still traveling with Dantos. So Jaime Lannister gave Brienne Oathkeeper the magic Valyrian steel sword that she bore, and a bunch of gold and sent her out looking for Sansa Stark in hopes that she could keep her oath to find Sansa and keep her safe. This led to Brienne traveling around the Riverlands and asking everyone she bumps into if they've seen a maid of 3 and 10 with auburn hair who may be traveling with a fool. She eventually hears the story of a man named Nimble Dick who was celebrating and buying rounds for everyone at the local bar, because he's just come into a large amount of money, at least a large amount of money for a peasant, for supposedly fooling a fool. When Brienne finds him, she pays him a little bit more money to get the information out of him, and what he tells her is that there was this fool who showed up looking for passage for 3 across the narrow sea, but he was afraid to go to the docks because Lord Randall Tarley's men were all watching the docks, and he needed a secret way to get out. This definitely sounds like Dantos Hollard trying to escape, so Brienne is very intrigued. So this fool is looking for a smuggler ship, and the reason that Nimble Dick was claiming to have fooled the fool is because he told him that he knew a place where smugglers would occasionally show up. And he claimed that he could draw him a map to get him there, which he did, and he was paid for it handsomely. The only problem is that this place that he drew the map to was the ruins of Dick Crabbe's ancestral home, and smugglers hadn't been there in decades because, again, it's a complete ruin in the middle of the woods. This castle is called the Whispers, which is a name that it earned back in the time of the legendary Clarence Crabbe, who Dick Crabbe is descended from. And he's completely surprised that Brienne's never heard of Clarence Crabbe because he was totally awesome and could pick up pine trees, rip them out of the ground, and throw them half a mile. At least that's what Dick says. But also the main legend around him is that he married a woods witch of a wife, and every person that Clarence Crabbe would defeat in battle, he would bring the body home to his woods witch wife, who would chop off the head and bring it back to life with a kiss. Which sounds completely crazy, but then you remember in the Riverlands at this very moment there are people who are being brought back from the dead with the kiss of life, Beric and then eventually Lady Catelyn as Lady Stoneheart. So part of this legend is pretty crazy, but also parts of it are hinting at actual magical things that happen in this world. Supposedly, Clarence Crabbe would keep all of these severed heads that are still kept alive down in the basement of the Whispers, and they would just whisper advice constantly, and every time you would go there, you would hear this whispering, and so the castle became called the Whispers. They're basically like those little heads in a jar in Futurama. Think like an old gods version of that. Now, for those of you who are long-term viewers of my channel, you probably know that I always get a little suspicious when someone's referred to as a woods witch in the histories, because I think there are certain cases where these wrinkled old little women who live out in the woods and do this old ways magic are actually possibly children of the forest using a glamour. We have the case of Leaf, the child of the forest who's in the cave with Bran, who's able to speak the common tongue because she says she walked the world of men for 200 years. And she has someone living in the cave with her who used a glamour, so glamoring yourself as a little old woman if you're a little child of the forest woman, well, that does make quite a bit of sense to me. And cases like the Ghost of Highheart and Maggie the Frog are at least very, very suspicious in terms of possibly being children of the forest. There's also a line in one of the early books where Jeor Mormont says to Jon that the children of the forest were able to speak to the dead. So this is a legend that goes around about the children of the forest that they can talk to the dead. We have actual evidence in the story of people being brought back to life with a kiss. So the idea of potentially a woods witch or a child of the forest kissing these heads and being able to then speak to the dead, well, it's all stuff that seems kind of crazy at first, but when you take a look at the actual magic that's being done in the stories and what the characters are saying, well, it does sort of weirdly line up. There's a lot of ambiguity to whatever's going on at the Whispers, and I think that George does like to handle a lot of his examples of magic like this, where you're sitting there going, okay, this could definitely be foreshadowing to some of the magic that's going on in the series, but it could also definitely just be historical legends that have been talked up throughout the ages and aren't actually true. And there's not really any way that you're ever going to know for sure so that we can debate it forever. I think George definitely likes to do that when he can in his stories, and honestly, that's a writing lesson you can probably take if you're ever writing stories. Make a lot of stuff really ambiguous so that it's a fun debate to have. And that's kind of what we're going to be doing in this video is trying to debate and figure out what exactly is going on at the Whispers magically. Obviously, there's the case of the Whispering Heads that we're going to be talking quite a bit about, because when Brienne gets there, she does indeed hear some whispering, or at least what sounds like whispering, and weirdly enough, she thinks about these Whispering Heads in her head, and the things that they whisper to her actually may end up saving her life. But as we'll get into, as I said, it's very ambiguous as to whether or not these heads are whispering and saving her life, some other random voice is popping into her head and saving her life, or perhaps it's just the voice of old Dick Crabbe remembering something that he said a little bit earlier that ends up saving Brienne. And by the end of the video, I'll pose the question to you so you can decide which you think is actually going on. But as I was saying, besides just these heads that are potentially being kissed by a woods witch or maybe a child of the forest in the ancient past and then whispering from the dead, well, there are some other weird things that are going on at the ruins of the Whispers that tie this place into the old gods in a way that really isn't seen anywhere else. Weirdly enough, and the thing that has always stood out the most to me about the Whispers is that Brienne's visit to the Whispers is the only time in the entire book series thus far that we've seen a Weirwood that's been described as a young Weirwood. If you search for Weirwood sapling, you're only going to find one result, and that's actually Bran appearing as a Weirwood sapling in a vision where Jon sees Bran. So basically, there's only one young Weirwood or Weirwood sapling or anything of that sort that I've been able to find in the series so far, and it's a young Weirwood at the ruins of the Whispers. That has definitely always stood out to me, and it's been the main thing that I've ever talked about in regards to the Whispers in previous videos, but I have always sort of had in the back of my mind that I should do a video on this chapter specifically, and the reason that it's happening now is because my friend Taco from Something to Talk About is also putting out his video on the Whispers right around now, and he asked if I would put one out at the same time, and I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. So I'll have a link to his video in one of the end cards here if you make it to the end of this one. Also, as a fair warning, this isn't one where there's like a big reveal coming at the end where I've got it secretly all figured out. This is one where I'm putting out a bunch of evidence for all of you guys and just putting out everything I have, putting as much context out as I can, and then hoping you guys can be my little whispering heads down underground and maybe I'll whisper in the comments what your ideas are, and maybe as a community we can figure out what exactly is going on here. There was a long time where the Night Fort and the Black Gate and that big well that was near it and the little weirwood that seems to be a branch growing off of the bigger weirwood organism, I was staring at all of that and had no idea what to make of it, and once I figured it out, well, then suddenly I figured out my theory on the wall, and a lot of things fell out from there, so maybe as a community, if we can discover something that we've missed about the Whispers, who knows, maybe there will be some more interesting information that we can glean from that. So dialing in on this young Weirwood, I don't think we necessarily really have any idea what Brienne means by a young Weirwood. Is this a Weirwood that's 20 years old, or is this a Weirwood that's 200 years old, but all the other Weirwoods in Westeros are over 1,000 years old, right? We don't really exactly know. We do know that this Weirwood is large enough for someone to hide up in the leaves of it, which we'll talk about later on, because someone drops down out of the Weirwood to attack Brienne and Dick Crabbe. But at the same time, this Weirwood is, for some reason to Brienne, described as young. She thinks of it as young, and again, we just really don't know exactly what that means. Supposedly, this castle's been a ruin for 1,000 years, so it would make some sense that at some point or another, the Weirwood that was originally here would have been cut down by the Andals when they came over, and, maybe at some point or another, then, in the 1,000 years that this thing has been a ruin, a new Weirwood has sprung up. I definitely think that it's impossible for this Weirwood to be over 1,000 years old, though, and have Brienne describe it as young, so yeah. It seems like whatever original Weirwood was in the godswood of this castle, assuming that there was one, it was cut down at some point, and a new Weirwood has sprouted up in its place. Now, I will fully admit that everything we know about growing weirwoods is fairly speculative. We know that they can't get one to take up in the Vale, and the main reason that people think this is the case is because weirwoods probably do need to be tied into the larger weirwood root network in order to actually survive. I personally also somewhat assume that there's probably some blood sacrifice that's required to get a weirwood to grow, but that is definitely very speculative. It's just a feeling that I sort of get based on everything we've seen about weirwoods and the fact that, getting them to grow seems to be fairly difficult, and this is the only young one that we're told about. Now, I don't necessarily think someone has, come to the Whispers, specifically purposefully planted this weirwood and made a sacrifice to get it to grow, But I do sort of wonder if perhaps, like when the original Weirwood was cut down, if maybe something about the root network down below the Whispers caused a new one to spring up, whereas normally maybe a cut down Weirwood would just stay cut down. This ruin definitely has more connections to weird old godsy style magic than most places where Weirwood seem to exist, with all those whispering heads that are supposed to be below the ground and the ancient woods witch who is supposed to live here. Who knows, maybe there could be a green seer or several down in the roots of the Weirwoods underneath this castle, and maybe their presence there is the thing that's causing a new Weirwood to sprout up. Like perhaps they need a connection to get some more sun or to get some more blood into the Weirwood roots or something like that that can feed these green seers down below the ground, and so they're using their magic, or the Weirwood roots are just naturally growing where they need the nutrients or something like that, right? And maybe that could be the reason that there's a Weirwood that sprouted up here, because there's either a green seer down below the ground who needs a Weirwood to sprout, or because there's just a higher presence of old godsy magic at the Whispers. I also think it's worth reading how George describes this Weirwood because, at least to me, it is very interesting. The bailey opened up before her, overgrown. To her left was the main gate and the collapsed shell of what might have been a stable. Saplings were poking out of half the stalls and growing up through the dry brown thatch of its roof. To her right, she saw rotted wooden steps descending into the darkness of a dungeon or a root cellar. Where the keep had been was a pile of collapsed stones, overgrown with green and purple moss. The yard was all weeds and pine needles. Soldier pines were everywhere, drawn up in solemn ranks. In their midst was a pale stranger, a slender young weirwood with a trunk as white as a cloistered maid. Dark red leaves sprouted from its reaching branches. Beyond was the emptiness of sky and sea where the wall had collapsed. Now, obviously, to me, that imagery is really striking because the idea of viewing this weirwood in the ruins of a collapsed wall, right? I know that the weirwood isn't literally inside the wall, but like the visual you get is this collapsed wall, and then there's a weirwood still standing there. And I do think if the wall were to collapse and all the ice were to break, there would be weirwood standing there. So, if that is indeed what happens, I do think maybe the reason this line is here and this weirwood is described this way is because it will go real hard in hindsight if we find there are indeed a bunch of weirwoods inside the wall when it collapses. I still don't know why the weirwood here is specifically described as a young weirwood and why this is the only young weirwood, but I do think in general that is somewhat what this weirwood is foreshadowing, the fact that there might be weirwoods inside the walls of some of these magical places and specifically the wall itself. Also, the way that this entire place is sort of being retaken by the trees and the plants and the moss, it definitely reminds you of what Harrenhal looks like in House of the Dragon, where there are weirwood roots growing out of the walls and things like that. I do think that all of this is somewhat pointing to the idea of like this connection with the plants that are overtaking the ruins, and maybe there being plants inside the structure of these ruins that are actually somewhat important. And so then, once this castle is abandoned, these magical plants maybe are just starting to take it over for themselves. So, more or less, that's what I have about this young Weirwood, and if you have any other ideas or anything that maybe I've missed that could add some interesting context to this, make sure to go whisper it down in the comments section, but on your way down there, make sure you kiss the like and subscribe button to bring them back to life. Speaking of which, let's talk about the other sort of magical thing that happens that's really significant in this chapter. Not only the fact that there's some whispering that whispers in Brienne's head and tells her to use her magic sword, but this is also the first time that she actually uses her Valyrian steel sword, and her reaction to that is pretty interesting. When she first takes it out of the scabbard and starts doing some practice cuts with it, she thinks that it even sounds sharper than other swords. And then when it comes to the time she's actually starting to fight with it, she's fighting 3v1, and she thinks that she's never moved as quick as she did when she's wielding this sword. So just straight up wielding this magical sword seems to make Brienne a faster and better fighter than she's ever been. Which, let's be clear, that is a thing that lines up with other things that we're told about this world. Arthur Dayne wielding Dawn is supposed to be pretty much undefeatable, and it seems like actually wielding the sword Dawn makes him a better fighter than he was not wielding Dawn, right? Like, if you took Arthur Dayne wielding Dawn versus Arthur Dayne wielding another sword, everyone would bet their money on Arthur Dayne wielding Dawn, because the sword makes him a better fighter. Brienne also at one point describes Oathkeeper as alive in her hands, which I think actually may hold a little bit more significance than you would first think, because there's a theory that I think is pretty well backed that, on some level or another, blood sacrifice seems to be required to forge or reforge Valyrian steel. Much like there's probably blood sacrificed souls that go into the Weirwoods to do Weirwood magic, and like there seems to be sacrifices required for there to be dragons, I think there's a pretty decent chance that there is some blood magic that goes into forging these swords, and the idea that there is actually a soul of some dead person that is physically contained inside this sword, making it literally alive on some level, well, magically that kinda tracks to me. There is also a hint earlier on in the chapter when they're talking about ancient legends, the legend of Clarence Crabbe. Well, Brienne says she's never heard of Clarence Crabbe, which Dick Crabbe is completely surprised about, but she says that around her home, Tarth, everyone talks about Sir Galladon of Morn, who was such a great knight that the maiden herself fell in love with him and gave him a magical sword which could never lose in a battle. But he never used the magical sword because it could never lose in a battle, and that just wouldn't be chivalrous or fair. And Dick Crabbe laughs at her and says how silly that is, and if he had run into old Clarence Crabbe, there would have been another magical head down below the whispers, whispering to the others, I should have used the magical sword. I should have used the bloody sword. So there's talk of magical swords that can't lose in battle, and Nimble Dick says that line, and then later on, when Brienne is at the actual whispers and she's about to go in, this is what happens. Go on, milady, urged Nimble Dick behind her. What are you waiting for? Old Crabbe's been dead 1,000 years. What was she waiting for? Brienne told herself she was being foolish. The sound was just the sea echoing endlessly through the caverns beneath the castle, rising and falling with each wave. It did sound like whispering, though, and for a moment she could almost see the heads sitting on their shelves, muttering to one another. I should have used the sword, one of them was saying. I should have used the magic sword. Podrick, said Brienne, there's a sword and scabbard wrapped up in my bedroll. Bring them here to me. And the sword that she sent Podrick to go and fetch is, of course, Oathkeeper, and this is the first time she actually wields it. Now, this is a situation that I actually think has a pretty satisfying resolution, whether it's magical or not, right? Either this is some sort of implanted thought in her head, either coming from the whispering heads down below the ground, or some green seer, potentially even Bran, who needs Brienne to survive this for some reason and is telling her, hey, go use the magic sword. Or the alternative is that this is basically just the funny joke that Dick Crabbe made earlier on in the chapter, coming back, popping into Brienne's head, and saving her life. So Brienne was either saved here by the old gods, or she was saved by the fact that Dick Crabbe is kinda funny. I honestly like both of those answers. On some level or another, she is saved by these whispering heads because it's the fact that there's the legend of the whispering heads that even makes her think back to the idea that Dick Crabbe had said, oh, I should have used the magic sword, and talking about the whispering heads and the legends of Clarence Crabbe. Well, that was the thing that brought this line up in the first place, so on some level or another, these whispering heads have just probably saved Brienne's life. Because if she wasn't using her Valyrian steel sword, which is able to cut through armor a lot easier than other swords would be able to, who really knows how this fight would have gone? She won it pretty easily, but that was using a magic sword. At the very least, I think we're meant to look at this whole thing and go, hey, wait a minute. It's weird that she switched swords right before this, then she thinks about how much better a fighter she is with this sword, and then she wins a 3v1 fight using her sword. So throughout this chapter, we've had hints at sort of ancient old ways magic. We've had hints at the idea of kissing someone and bringing them back to life, which is actively going on in the Riverlands at this point in the story with Beric and Catelyn. And also we've seen what it's like to wield a Valyrian steel sword, which seems to give some sort of a magical boost to your fighting abilities. The other interesting thing that happens that definitely makes me wonder even more if the old gods were sort of involved in Brienne switching swords and these voices popping into her head is the fact that when this fight breaks out, it seems pretty clear to me that there are 4 lives that are sacrificed to the Weirwood. The 3 men that they find inside are the fool Shagwell, not Dantos Hollard who they were looking for, as well as a man named Pig and a man named Timian. Brienne knows these 3 because they were with the brave companions when her and Jaime had been captured by them and when Jaime got his hand chopped off, and all 3 of them are basically terrible people who threaten to do terrible things to Brienne, which you can go and read the chapter for yourself to hear all about that. I'm not going to get this video demonetized by repeating it all. The one thing that's really interesting, though, is all of the tree connections to the way that these 3 men appear. I'll read them in just a moment, and you can see how there's this weird tree connection going on, but I also do want to point out that sometimes it's worth taking a look at the first line and the last line of a George R. R. Martin chapter, and this is how this chapter starts. East of Maidenpool, the hills rose wild, and the pines closed in about them like a host of silent gray-green soldiers. So, from the very beginning, he is comparing the trees to people and specifically soldiers. Then the final line of the chapter is together they shoved the dirt on top of Nimble Dick as the moon rose higher in the sky, and down below the ground the heads of forgotten kings whispered secrets. So we start focusing on the trees and we end focusing on the whispering heads as they bury Dick below a weirwood. And then when these outlaws pop out with their weapons, they're all somewhat related to trees. When they emerge, it says, Brienne saw a sapling sway. From the bushes slid a man so caked with dirt that he looked as if he had sprouted from the earth. A broken sword was in his hand, but it was his face that gave her pause. The small eyes and wide, flat nostrils. She knew that nose. She knew those eyes. Pig, his friends had called him. Everything seemed to happen in a heartbeat. A second man slipped over the lip of the well, making no more noise than a snake might make slithering across a pile of wet leaves. He wore an iron half-helm wrapped in stained red silk, and had a short, thick throwing spear in his hand. Brienne knew him too. From behind her came a rustling as a head poked down through the red leaves. Crabbe was standing underneath the weirwood. He looked up and saw the face. "Here," he called to Brienne. "It's your fool." "Dick," she called urgently. "To me." Shagwell dropped down from the weirwood, braying laughter. He was garbed in motley, but so faded and stained that it showed more brown than gray or pink. In the place of a jester's flail, he had a triple morning star, three spiked balls chained to a wooden haft. He swung it hard and low, and one of Crabbe's knees exploded in a spray of blood and bone. He then proceeds to smash Dick's face in with the morning star below that weirwood, making Dick's death definitely 100% a sacrifice to the weirwood, intentional or not. But okay, let's again just think about how all three of these men are at least somewhat related to trees when they enter. One of them enters when a sapling sways and he emerges from a bush, and then he looks so dirty like he's sprouted up from the ground, like a tree would. And when I was talking to Taco about this, he also pointed out how him wielding a broken sword is somewhat reminiscent of Waymar Royce in the prologue when he has his sword break and then he's eventually raised as a wight wielding a broken sword. Then the next guy emerges from a well, which is another thing that happens in the other chapter where there's a lot of weird Weirwood shenanigans going on at a weird ruin that has a Weirwood in it, and that's of course at the Night Fort, which is where Sam and Gilly pop up out of the big well there and scare Bran and company, and then eventually lead him down through the Black Gate. So, if you're familiar with my theories, the idea that this giant well is in fact a giant hollowed out weirwood trunk does kind of make a lot of sense, considering there seems to be a branch poking off the top of it, and it has a weirwood face partway down the shaft, which is what would happen to a weirwood trunk. There'd be branches at the top and a weirwood face partway down. So, yeah, it seems like the well in that case might be a giant weirwood. And this well, it's not actually probably a giant weirwood itself. I think we are on some level or another meant to maybe make that connection. But just in case we missed it, George also compares him to a snake slithering over leaves. So we have a tree connection with the first two, and then obviously Shagwell drops down out of the weirwood tree. So that's the most direct connection. He's literally just in a weirwood and he drops down and then quickly kills someone under that weirwood. Brienne, as I mentioned, goes on to win this 3v1 fight, and Shagwell is the one who she kills last, and she actually forces him at sword point to dig a grave by hand, which takes him all the rest of the day, and he digs that grave below the weirwood, which she places Dick's body into, and as she's placing the body there, she expects him to attack, which he does, and she kills him with a dagger as he wields a rock. All four of these deaths take place in close proximity to this weirwood, and two of them take place directly underneath it, making this bloody kill definitely a sacrifice to the old gods, whether intentional or not, as I mentioned before. So yeah, we have all of these hints of this idea that maybe there is some sort of weird old godsy whispering going on at the Whispers, and these whispers lead to Brienne using a magical sword to feed a bunch of blood to the Weirwood tree. So that definitely seems right up the alley of the old gods. As I mentioned, it's all kept pretty ambiguous, and it's a situation that I really don't exactly know fully what to make of it. Maybe there is, as I said, something I'm missing that one of you can point out down there in the comments that'll make it all click fully into place. But generally, what I see here is a bunch of somewhat ambiguous hints at the broader magic that's going on in the series, and a lot of it is on display in a very subtle way here at the Whispers. I don't know if there's any grand reveal that we could possibly put together, or something that could make more sense of something else if we're able to figure it out, or anything like that, really. But at the same time, I'm not completely closed to the idea, and maybe if there is something that we're missing that's sort of old godsy and Weirwood adjacent, well, maybe there is something in this chapter that we can put together. As I was talking to Taco making this video, he pointed out an idea that he was thinking about that what if it's Clarence Crabbe? What if he became a green seer and he's the one who's able to somewhat communicate and he would be the one who was then getting the blood that's fed into this Weirwood, so maybe he would want Brienne to kill these people who are, kind of being assholes in his home. And another thing that Taco pointed out that's kind of cool about this idea, if Clarence Crabbe ended up becoming a green seer or tied into the Weirwood roots on some level, he's basically now then a part of this plant network that's retaking his home. The ruins are being sort of swallowed up by the plants, and if Clarence Crabbe is tied into the plants deep down in the roots, well, that's kinda cool. He did have a Woods Witch wife, and there is obviously the fact that green seers do exist in this world, so maybe he did end up becoming one. Who really knows? Or maybe it's just some other ancient child of the forest who's a green seer deep down below this tree. Let me know what you guys think of any of that, or if there's anything else that I missed about the Whispers that you find interesting. As I said, be my little whispering heads down there in the comments, and definitely go check out Taco's video on the whispers after this in case there's something else that he brought up that I missed that maybe helps you put this together. Thank you all for watching, remember to like and subscribe before you go, and I'll be back with something else very soon.